Hello everyone, and in this lecture I'm just going to go over my own solution for the tic-tac-toe project. Your solution might look totally different, and that's okay as long as it works, but in case you're stuck on anything or just want to see how I would tackle this tic-tac-toe within Jupyter Notebook, I'll go ahead and walk through my own solution. So first off, what I did was, since I'm using the IPython or Jupyter Notebook, I imported this statement from ipython.display import clear output. So that allowed me to clear the printed output to update that print statement which printed the board. Then I created some global variables. I made an empty list that was 10 elements long, and then I set a variable called GameState equal to true, and then announce equal to a blank string. And we'll get on into those later on. Next, I made a function that resets the board in this case, I'm going to store the values as a list. So note, the game's going to ignore the 0 index. So the way my tic-tac-toe game worked is, if you remember, if you ever have a keyboard with a numpad, that's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 as a little square on the right side of the keyboard. So I'm using those numbers to correlate with my tic-tac-toe board. So for instance, if you click the 7 on the numpad, that's going to be the top left square of that tic-tac-toe board. So I have my function here that resets the board, and it takes in this case, since I'm using Jupyter Notebook, I've set board and game state to be global variables, and board's going to be reset to an empty board, that list, and game state's going to be true. Okay, so next I created a function to display the board, and like I mentioned, I'll use the numpad as the board reference. So could just make the board and player classes later, but since we haven't learned about object-oriented programming, we're just using functions right now. So here I have my function display board and the doc string that goes along with it. Let me zoom out so it's a little more readable. So this function prints out the board, so the numpad can be used as reference. So what it does is it prints out the board, which is that empty list, and notice the numbers align with a numpad. And then it also has this clear output function. So define a function to check for a win by comparing inputs in the board list. And maybe I should have just have a list of winning combinations and cycle through them. That's an option there as well. So my current function is kind of this big chunk of Boolean checks. So I have a win check here, and it just checks if all the diagonal combinations is equal to player. And what player is, it's an argument that's either an O or X string. So that way I can check for a win by getting an input board, which is that list, and then checking if any of the diagonals are all equal to each other. And I have this OR statement to check for any diagonals. And that dash just breaks the line there. So this all isn't on one huge line. Then I return true if there's a win, otherwise I return false. Then I define the function to check if the board is already full in case of a tie. And this is pretty straightforward since our board is stored as a list. And just remember that index 0 is always empty. So I said if there's a blank in the board, remember the board starts out empty from anywhere from 1 to 9, then I return false. Otherwise, there's still remaining blanks and the board's not full yet. Okay. After that, I created a function to get player input and do various checks on it. So I said ask player and then mark. So it asks the player where to place their X or O mark, and then it checks the validity of it. So it inputs that global board, and then it says this request, choose where to place your mark, plus mark, based on which player it is. And while true, I have this try statement. I say try the choice, this raw input, and it says if the player doesn't input a number, let's say they input a string, I print this value error and then say continue. So it's going to keep asking this person for correct input from 1 to 9. And then I have this if board choice is equal to blank, then set it equal to the mark and then break. Otherwise, if there's something already in that board space, I print space isn't empty, continue, and it goes back here asking for another input. So now we want to have a function that takes in the player's choice via the askPlayer function and returns the game state. So I have this function called player choice, which takes in a mark. We input that global board, the global game state, and then that announce statement. And I set the blank game state announcement. So I have announce, just an empty string. I get the player input with mark, make sure it's a string by casting it to a string. I validate the player input, so I ask the player. Remember, mark is just that X or O string. And then I check for a player win with a win check function. And then that win check, what it's going to do is afterwards, if it's a win, it clears the output, displays the board, it announces that somebody won, either X or O, and then sets the game state equal to false. Then I show the board, I clear the output, display the board again. I check for a tie, just in case, if no one had won. I say if the full board check, then I announce a tie and set the game state returns to false. And then I return the game state and the announcement. And you'll see why I do that when I put it all together in a function called playGame. So what does my playGame function do? It resets the board and takes in the global announce variable. Sets the mark X and O's. And it says while true, clear the output, display the board. So it's going to show the board. Then I have the player X turn, which is going to output the game state and the announce from that player choice function we just went over. It prints that announcement, and if the game state is then equal to false, meaning there's a tie or somebody wins, it goes ahead and breaks this while loop. And then same thing for player O. Get the player choice, get the game state and the announcement, print the announcement. If game state is equal to false, that means somebody won or there's a tie, go ahead and break. And then finally, after that, I ask the player for a rematch, which I take in the raw input. Would you like to play again? Yes or no? If it's a rematch equals yes, we play game again. Else, we just print thanks for playing, and that's it. And you can go ahead and check this out by downloading the notebook and then running this last cell, which is play game. Okay, I know that was a lot, and really the best way to go about doing this, if you were very, very confused on the tic-tac-toe project in general, is just to go line by line and type this out yourself, and you'll realize you'll have a better understanding of how this all comes together. And I know it's a lot of embedded functions, which sometimes is confusing, but if you just go slowly and methodically through this, you should have no problem then understanding if you just manually type this out if you're having trouble with the tic-tac-toe project to begin with. Okay, now that being said, I hope you didn't have too much trouble with the tic-tac-toe project. It should have been challenging, and you should have had some moments of struggle, but hopefully you didn't think it was totally impossible. Okay, thanks so much, and I'll see you at the next lecture.